In the last video, we looked at chapter 18 of Chronicles, which focused on some battles with David. Chapter 19 fills in some of the details, giving a background story for one of those conflicts. So in this video, we'll take chapters 19 and 20 together. But if you're just curious about the Goliath issue, I'll put a timestamp for you so that they can go to just that spot. Otherwise, if you're one of the dozens of people following along, we'll continue as usual, commenting on some things we find interesting along the way. And we'll begin with a summary of the chapter from the Faith Life study notes. Actually, in the parallel account of Samuel gives a nice summary. But again, I would encourage you to read the entire chapters for yourself, but we'll just use this as a roadmap. So here, it says chapter 10, again, that's Samuel, but it parallels here in chapter 19 as well, but it reads, it opens with the death of Nahash, the king of the Ammonites. David sends envoys to Nahash's son, Elhanan, out of respect and insists that he honor their previous arrangement. After receiving foolish advice from his fellow Ammonites, Elhanan rebels and enlists the Arameans, Syrians, to assist him. Since Yahweh is with David wherever he goes, David defeats the rebellious vassals and regains control of their regions. And again, the parallel account occurs here for us in chapter 19. So let's go ahead and just start taking it apart. Broadly speaking, Merrill had a note here that I found interesting, specifically this latter part. So he wrote that any pretense to monarchy in the ancient Near East had to be validated by great military achievement. In David's case, two neighboring nations, Ammon to the east and Philistia to the west, posed the greatest threats to the stability of his new regime, and that's what we're mostly dealing with in these chapters, is these two powers. So interestingly, these same two enemies preoccupied Jephthah and Samson, respectively and contemporaneously in the latter part of the 12th century. And of course, you read about those stories in Judges. And commenting on this language of now after this, the opening line, again, Johnstone's noting the vague chronology that goes along with it, but broadly speaking, I only include this because he's making the point that, again, it's unlikely that chapter 19 recounts a second campaign of David against Hadadezer of Zobah. So realistically, this is, again, giving more detail to the battle previously in chapter 18. And he points out here that the numbers match tolerably. They're not perfect, but most commentators are going to look at this and say the numbers are close enough that we should go ahead and take this as the same conflict, just with a bit more detail and a bit more of the backstory involved. And moving on to Nahash the king, Johnstone comments that here Nahash, the previous king, whose name means snake, he was the previous king, the previous ruler, and he was actually the ruler with the episode with Saul when he liberated the people of Jabesh Gilead, which is a bit important because that detail might pop up again. Mostly here we want to look at the fact that here in verse 2 it talks about how David said, "I will deal kindly with Elhanan, the son of Nahash, for his father dealt kindly with me." That language of dealing kindly is hesed here. So let's go ahead and look at this. Myers notes here that literally I will do hesed with Elhanan, as his father did hesed with me. The term means loyalty, devotion to an obligation. Behind the term lies the deep Israelite feeling for mutual devotion to an obligation assumed in a common cause. And here the common cause would seemingly be opposition to Saul. Of course, David never takes that opposition to actually taking arms against Saul because he didn't want to harm the Lord's anointed, that kind of idea. But Nahash obviously didn't have those that same reservation, but they did have the common enemy of Saul. But again, I think that this figures into this broader story. So after the father dies, Nahash, Elhanan reigns, and then David sends messengers. And let's just read this comment from Merrill. So Merrill's pointing out, because of the previous friendship, David sends a delegation to send condolences. And perhaps because of envy, paranoia, or vengeance, Elhanan, based on the counsel of his advisors, accused David's messengers of spying with the ultimate objective of overthrowing the Ammonite royal house. And concerning the detail of the fact that they shaved them and cut their garments, a clean-shaven Semite was an embarrassment to himself and to his community. And here it lists Isaiah 7:20, indicating perhaps a loss of his masculinity. One would shave his own beard only as a token of mourning or deep repentance. And here it lists a number of occurrences. To add to this the exposure of the private parts was an unspeakably ignominious act, and here it lists a number of references, although I would take out Genesis 9:22. I have a video on Genesis 9. I don't think that one is involving simply an act of nakedness being exposed. I think it's a euphemism. But continuing on, but this is precisely how David's men were treated. When David heard of this great humiliation, he directed his men to find security and incubation at Jericho until they were publicly presentable again. We'll pick up in verse 5. When David was told concerning the men, he sent messengers to meet them, for the men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, "Remain at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return." Commenting on this language here, David does nothing in retaliation to Hanan's act. Lightheart points out that David endures the shame very much within his character so far, and of course compare that to Saul. But this is a point that many of the commentators make, is David takes this insult and actually doesn't respond. And moving on here, when the Ammonites saw that they had become a stench to David, Hanan and the Ammonites sent basically money to hire mercenaries here. And concerning this language, this particular language, I think we have a literal rendering here. Made themselves stinking to David. That's the way you would literally render it. But Selman points out that this word, again, this stench language, is used for decaying animal or vegetable matter and applied metaphorically where relationships had totally collapsed. Again, there he lists a number of references. And Merrill points out here that the Ammonites, rather than making amends, they persuade the Arameans to take up arms against Israel. And they specifically supply much of the chariot force, which becomes important. In Lightheart commenting on this act of hiring the mercenaries, he says he, and that is in context Hanan, anticipates that David will punish Ammon for the insult. So he hires Aramean mercenaries and besieges Medeba, a city in the tribal area of Reuben. This is no longer an insult, but an attack. And David responds by sending Joab to protect and liberate the cities. And commenting here, Selman in his commentary says that David's embassy to Ammon's old enemy Jabesh-Gilead for their kindness to Saul's family was interpreted in some Ammonite quarters as an unfriendly act. And that's what we were talking about earlier, because Saul liberated this settlement from the Ammonite attack. And when Saul was killed in battle, you get the men of Jabesh-Gilead come and retrieve Saul, his body, and I believe also additionally his son's bodies from the wall, and they give him a royal burial. We discussed this a little bit in chapter 10, and David actually thanks them for their loyalty to Saul as well. And so the fact that David sends this embassy to thank the men of Jabesh-Gilead would be seen in Ammonite quarters as hostility towards them. But again, they did have a common cause in the fact that David was also an enemy of Saul. But again, they don't understand how David did ultimately respect Saul because of his status as the king, as the Lord's anointed, that kind of idea. They didn't appreciate that aspect. So they perhaps interpreted that as an act of hostility towards them. And concerning the location here, that they came in and camped before Medeba, Japhet has a number of comments, and some of the others do as well. But hers are kind of illustrative of the issue, although I think Selman does kind of answer. But we'll scrub through a little bit. Normally I don't get this granular in some of this stuff, but it might be worth looking at, because here she points out that the mention of Medeba is problematical. This was a city in Moab south of the land of Ammon, and it is not likely that the war was fought so far to the south. Now other commentators believed, she goes here with who is it, Rudolph, suggested that it should follow the reading of Rabbah, the water of Rabbah, following 2 Samuel. And she says that it's possible, orthographically it's possible. However, there's no evidence that Rabbah, the Ammonite capital, was designated Rabbah. And more importantly, it's hardly plausible that the Ammonites, who had themselves initiated the hostilities, would choose their own capital as the battleground, even if they were sure of their victory. Some other city, probably closer to the Israelite border, would be more likely. But Selman points out in his commentary that Hanan's insults have sometimes been placed in David's early years before David was fully secure. But there is evidence that the fears of the Ammonite leaders may have been fueled by more than just contempt for an upstart. Location of the subsequent battle at Medeba in verse 7, south of the Ammonite capital, Rabbah could suggest that David had already subdued Edom and Moab, perhaps even that the Israelite army was returning from victory there. Both Israelite and Ammonite Aramean forces gathered at Medeba, a city mentioned in the 9th century Moabite stone. Being some distance southwest of Ammon on the King's Highway, it has sometimes been considered an error for waters of Rabbah. That's what we read above. But Medeba may be connected with a struggle for control of the King's Highway, or with Joab's Edomite and Moabite campaigns. The Aramean kings were in the open country, indicating the forefront of the battle, while the Ammonite troops in the rear guarded the city, either Medeba or the Ammonite capital, Rabbah. So, point is, it's not, I think, as insurmountable as people like Japhet make it out to be, but we'll continue moving on. We'll just kind of summarize the battle itself. So the Ammonites come out and draw up in front of the city and the kings, and it's referring here to the Syrians, that they came and were by themselves in the open country. So basically, as Joab notes here, he saw that the battle was set against him in front and in the rear. The point is, they're essentially surrounded, and they're going to have to fight this two-front battle. And so Joab picks his army, and he's going to fight on that side, and he puts his brother in charge of the other part of the army to fight the Ammonites. And he says, if the Syrians are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, I will help you. Be strong and let us use our strength for our people and for the cities of our God. And may the Lord do what seems good to him. By the way, this phrase is unique to this story here, cities of our God. I don't believe that language ever occurs again. But we'll just look at some of the language here. So Johnstone points out that the Masoretic text adds a paragraph marker between the two if clauses in verse 12 in the middle of Joab's speech. Again, if the Arameans are too strong for me, then you will come to my rescue. If the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will rescue you. This arresting of the flow of the narrative lays stress on two key terms, be strong and rescue. And of course, this language of being strong here, Han has a note here that throughout these chapters we hear echoes of the earlier conquest of the land under Moses and Joshua. Joab's exhortation before the battle with the Ammonites, be of good courage, or be strong, is the same as that given by God and Moses to Joshua before his entrance into the Promised Land. Like Joshua and the people, David and all Israel cross over the Jordan in chapter 19, verses 17 and 18. And again, like Joshua, David dedicates the spoils of his military victory, silver, gold, and bronze, to the Lord. Selman observes that by depicting David's triumphs in the south, east, north, the chronicler shows David as coming nearer than any other Israelite leader to completing the task first given to Moses and Joshua. So the battle begins, and Joab breaks the Syrians first, and then, of course, the Ammonites see this, and they return to the city. And then Joab is going to return back to Jerusalem. But the Syrians, after suffering this defeat, are going to link up with more soldiers. So it reads here that they sent messengers and brought out the Syrians who were beyond the Euphrates, with Shobak, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, at their head. And of course, this is chapter 18. In last chapter, it referred to him setting up a monument, or literally setting up his hand by the Euphrates. And so this is where this chapter links back up with the previous chapter. And we already looked at this battle last chapter, so spoiler alert, the Israelites win this battle, and you have this conclusion statement that Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, and they made peace with David and became subject to him. So the Syrians were not willing to save the Ammonites anymore. So it seems as if part of the victory conditions here were that the Syrians would no longer be allied with the Ammonites. And that is chapter 19, which itself flows right into chapter 20. And we have this phrase, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, Joab led out the army and ravaged the country of the Ammonites and came and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Of course, this detail here is given more of a backstory in the parallel in Samuel. This is the episode in which the affair happens with David and Bathsheba. This is the battle that's going on. And of course, note the irony that it's the time of the year when kings go out to battle, And of course, David remained in Jerusalem and has this affair. And I mean, it says the kings go out to battle and then Joab led out the army. So that there's this incongruity there. And I like this note here by Johnstone about this language of ravaged. He says it's literally destroyed. And I point out that this language looks forward to the angel destroying in the next chapter. And of course, Johnstone is making this point in the unique use of this term in Chronicles. And so it says, and David struck down Rabbah and overthrew it, and David took the crown of their king from his head. And of course, this seems kind of incongruent because it says that David remained at Jerusalem, but then David's taking the crown from the king's head. And so what gives, right? But if you actually read in the Samuel account, what happens is when they're about to officially win, Joab sends word to David and tells him, to go down there and finish the siege, basically, so that David could get credit, so that the people wouldn't say that Joab took the city. And so David arrives, and he's there to take the crown from the king's head. And it says that he found that it weighed a talent of gold, and in it was a precious stone, and it was placed on David's head. And he brought out the spoils, so on and so forth. But I wanted to know on this crown language. Japhet has a nice note. It says, whose was this crown? The seemingly natural reference to their king entails some difficulties. The plural suffix there has no antecedent, as the city and not the people were previously referred to. And the weight of the crown, explicitly recorded as a talent of gold, would make the crown too weighty to be worn by a human monarch. Alternative exegetical tradition regards the MLKM as a proper name of the Ammonite god, usually called Milcom, or as Malcolm. So, point is, some commentators think that this crown was associated with the deity. It was a crown that was put on some kind of idol or something to that effect. I do find it interesting, though. One thing I can't help but think about. Right on the heels of this story against the Ammonites, we're going to flow into Philistine giants and episodes with them. And David has been dealing with giants a couple of times, of course, namely with Goliath. But I do find it interesting. I mean, even this line, it seems she obviously wouldn't go in this direction, but I find that funny that she says this, that this crown would be too weighty to be worn by a human monarch. I just kind of find that funny because it's you are now. I don't believe in comically big giants, like 30 feet tall or something silly like that. But I do find it interesting that she's kind of saying, and many of the commentators point out that the crown would be too heavy to be worn. One of the commentaries pointed out it would be a short coronation with David. They would put the crown on his head and then taken it off shortly thereafter because it would be too heavy to wear all the time. But anyway, point is, I do find it funny that they often point out that the crown just seems too big for a normal person to wear it as a crown. And then, of course, right off the heels of this, we enter into battles and conflicts with giants. It's just kind of odd. One last thing, though, before we get to the giant issue, is we have this language here in verse 3. It says, and he brought out the people who were in it, presumably the city, and set them to labor with saws and irons, picks and axes. And thus David did to all the cities of the Ammonites. Then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. Now, believe it or not, there's some controversy here, and probably not what you're thinking, because you're probably thinking, the forced labor, like how bad that is or whatever. But no, it's actually worse than that for some people, because literally it would read something like, and he brought out the people who were in it, and the footnote here should say it. Yeah, literally, and he sawed with saws and irons and picks and axes. So some, let's see if the note here has it. She's just pointing out. Although Johnstone does say it here. So Johnstone is one of the only commentators that takes this view here. But let's just go ahead and point it out, because this is illustrative of the fact that some take this as he sawed them with saws, irons and picks and axes. Not that he put them to labor, but that he used these implements, this stuff on them. So Johnstone says that that it includes this grisly detail of torture and mass execution of the inhabitants of Ammon. Now, again, Johnstone is unique here. Basically, nobody else takes this position. If let's see, I want to draw the end of it, because he does have, I think, picking up here, he says, but before the conclusion is drawn that Chronicles endorses acts of barbarity in the Lord's name, the evidence to follow in 1 Chronicles 21 and 22 must be weighed up. So I don't believe that this is the interpretation to take, but it is kind of interesting in light of that, because what's immediately going to follow in chapter 21. He says, the reader has now been given ample evidence that David is indeed the one who has shed much blood and has thereby disqualified himself from building the temple. There is also the question of whether David has fully appreciated the sacral nature of these wars, precisely the point at issue in his census in 1 Chronicles 21. So we'll obviously get there when we get there. But I do find that really interesting. And so I wonder if we can't take this observation without going that full direction, with this being a reference to torture or something of the like. Because part of the problem is, if you actually compare this to 2 Samuel, the parallel, it says, and he brought out the people who were in it and set them to labor with saws and irons and picks and axes and made them toil at the brick kilns, so on and so forth. But it doesn't have the same language. That here the set is very much appointed, right? So he appointed them with saws, irons. So it seems pretty obvious in the Samuel account. It doesn't refer to that. It refers to labor. So I think that for whatever reason it words it this way, kind of, I think, like in a verbal sense, I guess. But I think we should bring it in line with Samuel. Somewhat ironically, that is kind of tied to this next issue of concerning the giants. And again, the big issue with concerning David and Goliath and all that. So let's just go ahead and move forward. I have a note here that verses 4 through 8, which is the continuation here, basically this entire section dealing with the giants specifically of Philistia here, that the section is 68 words, or 4 times 17, again, a divine number, as well as 272 letters, which is 16 times 17. So near complete symmetry there, even on a letter level. And we'll pick up here with a comment from Jacob Meyer's commentary. He says, all 3 skirmishes with the Philistines center about giants. The whole idea of giants here and in the parallels may be due to the traditional belief that Canaan was a land of giants, and compare that with Genesis. These giants were said to be descendants of Rabbah, the eponymous ancestor of the Rephaim. The use of the article with Rabbah, the giants, in verses 6 and 8 points up to this fact. And so now to the issue of who killed Goliath. Because if we looked at it, let's just go ahead and start this interactive. I believe Michael Heiser made this. But it says 1 Samuel 17. You have David killed Goliath, the well-known David versus Goliath story. But 2 Samuel 21:19 reads here that Elhanan, the son of Jehoiakim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite. So that here you have another person killing Goliath, which is odd. And in 1 Chronicles 25, Elhanan, the son of Jehoiakim, struck down Lamai, the brother of Goliath. Right, so that just adds to some of the confusion. So it's like, what gives? So here you have David killing Goliath, Elhanan killing Goliath, but then you have Elhanan killing the brother of Goliath. So how do we reconcile these things? So broadly speaking, scholars take 2 different trajectories with this issue. Option number 1 is they'll tend to see this as a classic case of scribal or copyist type issues, because there's at least one obvious example that everybody agrees with is an example of dautography. And we'll get to that when we get there. But they would look at this and say that we need to bring the 2 Samuel text in line with 1 Chronicles. And when you do that, there's no contradiction. So you have 1 Samuel 17 has David kill Goliath. 2 Samuel, when corrected, agrees with Chronicles that Elhanan killed Goliath's brother, this Lamai figure. So that's the first trajectory that people take, is to basically reconcile the text, because you can see when I show you, you'll see how easy it would be for this to happen. The second option, scholars will treat this as a classic case of multiple traditions that were brought into Scripture and kind of jammed together, and so therefore you sometimes just have blatant contradictions. So they'll look at 2 Samuel as the original text, and that sometime later, probably for propaganda purposes, David is credited with killing Goliath. And then later, you have the chronicler come and attempt to smooth over or correct this contradiction. So those really are the 2 options. The second one's almost easier to explain just because it's simpler to just say it's a contradiction and then move on, I guess. I mean, from a scholarly standpoint. But I think the first option is better, but it requires a bit of explanation. Now, there's videos and articles like this one here. This article does a good job here. Now, specifically this chart, I think is really helpful, Because as you can see, most of this is in agreement, right? You have them Elhanan strike, or the son of this person striking down, and then in agreement Goliath the Gittite. But the questions are all this center part, right? So beginning with this origim term, this actually means weavers, which shows up again in 2 Samuel further down in the text. And so most scholars, again, I haven't seen anybody break from this explanation, is that this term was accidentally placed there. Topography is when you accidentally duplicate a letter or a word or something like that. And it seems an obvious example of that. So that accidentally got placed earlier in the text, and then it becomes part of a compound name. But the bigger issues are right here. These three boxes basically will give us the explanation for what's going on here, the problems. So the issue seems to be this. The 2 Samuel scribe or whatever took the direct object marker, directing it to Lamai. He took it as the beginning of part of Bethlehem, the Bethlehemite. And so he took this as one word rather than a direct object marker and then this name, Lamai. And when you actually see the similarity, you could see how that would happen. And then the other mistake is that here, he took this as a direct object marker. So here he missed the direct object marker and took it as a part of a word. Here, you kind of have the opposite problem, where it should read, presumably if you go with Chronicles, brother of Goliath, but the direct object marker looks almost exactly the same. And so he took it as a direct object pointing to Goliath. So that's how you have Elhanan striking down, again, direct object marker, Goliath, the Gittite, rather than the brother of Goliath. So that's really the problems of how you get there. Again, others can go into greater detail, but more or less, that's how you would end up with the problem. And I'm just going to kind of scrub through this interactive here because this hits on, again, all the things we just went over, right? So here we have the differences between the two texts, specifically Lamai, the brother, and Bethlehemite. Again, that's going to be the same word. These are the same terms, what's highlighted in orange. And then here, again, you see the problems here with the direct object marker, brother of. See, look at this, the brother of, and then the object marker. You see how similar they are, especially if this foot is kind of obscured a bit. You can see how somebody can make that mistake and turn what should be a direct object marker to this guy's name into the Bethlehemite. And that's how you would end up with that. And here he gives the example of topography, where again, as you can see later on, like a weaver's beam, again, weaver, exact same term gets applied here to this name as part of the compound name. But again, it probably should drop out of the text completely, as is the case in Chronicles. And here, again, he's giving the explanation for what happened with that, how you got that compound name. And then he says this, the duplicated origim makes the rest of the verse incomprehensible. Gerar origim killed my bread Goliath is corrected to Gerar origim, the Bethlehemite killed Goliath. And so this would be, this second, or this last sentence here would be the way it's rendered in Samuel. Again, when you misread some of this stuff, that's how you could get there. And again, as you can see, the visual similarity between the Hebrew and how you could confuse that for that. And again, here, similar problem here with the confusion of letters and similar shapes, reading the object marker in place of brother of. So here you have the brother of Goliath, and instead you have direct object marker Goliath. And again, you can see how easily that happens if you obscure the foot a little bit. And if you've ever seen actual, it's one thing to look at it here in kind of pristine form, but if you ever look at manuscripts, they're a mess. It'd be very difficult to read. And here you kind of have examples color-coded. And the conclusion here that, again, you have David killing Goliath in chapter 17, 1 Chronicles, Elhanan kills Lamai, and again, the conclusion here is 2 Samuel should be corrected to match 1 Chronicles 25. And when you do that, there is no contradiction, which I would agree with. Just, broadly speaking on specifically the second option, the multiple tradition option, I just find some of the conclusions odd. one of the counter arguments against this view is that Chronicles would not be the original text because Chronicles comes sometime later. But I find that odd because, especially coming from this group of people that tend to purport so many times to be able to see different traditions and texts, like because it's come up quite a bit in the commentaries, the idea of Samuel as well as Chronicles drawing from some other text, kind of like Q if you know about the gospel stuff. And so if there was some kind of Q document for some of the history books, then why couldn't we have Chronicles and Samuel both attempting to be writing from the same text? And Samuel just made a couple of errors in places. And so we should bring Samuel in line with Chronicles. It's not that Chronicles is older, it's that they're both drawing on the same text, but Chronicles was more accurate in relaying that text. And for some reason, they don't go in that direction at all. I have my suspicions, and I could go longer on this issue for that reason, because, it might get to that point of being a little bit of a to-the-man argument, but I feel like there are reasons why scholars go in that direction. And it's not just data-driven, although you can make the argument. I see where the argument comes from. I just think that bringing Samuel in line with Chronicles makes more sense. I find it odd that Samuel notoriously has some scribal issues, especially even in that verse. That's not the only place that just the ditography. There's other issues as well as what we looked at beyond that are problems that people detect. I find it odd that they would go with that text in Samuel, one line, when you have another line in Chronicles that says something different, and then you have the entire chapter of 1 Samuel 17 and tradition and all that says that David killed Goliath. But you're going to go with the one sentence in 2 Samuel that says something different, even though it can be explained. I find that it seems pretty odd to me to cling to that one verse that has the problems in it. It seems odd to me. But that is going to be chapters 19 and 20. And again, I'll link to some of the other longer explanations that other people have offered. I think people do a good job of it. I'll see you guys for chapter 21, which is going to be very involved. That's a very difficult passage as well. But I'll see you guys then.